Allow me to describe to you a man. No, not that kind. This man was an enigmatic American visionary with a proclivity for showmanship in his keynote speeches. An ideas man who saw the big picture but was known for obsessing over the smallest details. A man who thrived at the intersection of art and science, of practicality and aesthetics. This was a man who didn't ask what the market wanted, but rather told the market what it needed. He was a controlling, compulsive taskmaster who was forced out of his own company less than 10 years after his landmark innovation. A man who invented something that could capture your experience, yet could still fit in your pocket. He was a college dropout who started his business in a garage. This person quite literally changed the world and redefined how we interact with those around us. By now, you might have some idea of who I'm describing to you, and I think you're spot on. I'm talking about Edwin Land.
We are still a long way from the realization of the concept of a camera that would be, like the telephone.
And we are calling it iPhone.
Our long-awaited ultimate camera that is a part of the evolving human being. But a camera that you would use as often as your pencil or your eyeglasses.
And really take care of a lot of drudgery to free people to do much more creative work.
All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated.
Apple wouldn't be what it is today without Steve Jobs, that much is obvious. Perhaps a bit less obvious is that Apple wouldn't be what it is today without Edwin Land and the work that he accomplished at Polaroid. Steve Jobs was the successor to Edwin Land in both a spiritual and very real, very practical sense. What I'm getting at is this. Edwin Land laid the foundation upon which Steve Jobs built his house. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. The fact that the methods and stories of two titans of technological innovation are so intertwined is perhaps no surprise. After all, every success in one generation is built upon the successes of the generations that came before, but from the surface level manner in which their stories merely resemble each other's to the ways in which Steve Jobs intentionally styled himself after his childhood hero Edwin Land, the sheer amount of similarities between the two are simply staggering. Now that we're about 2 minutes in or more, let's start at their respective beginnings. Both were raised in a blue-collar family of modest means. Land's father was a scrap metal dealer, and Paul Jobs, after finishing his time in the Coast Guard, was a repo man and made some more money on the side by refurbishing and selling old junked cars. Edwin Land and Steve Jobs, born in 1909 and 1955, respectively, both followed the precocious boy genius stereotype. They were prone to wreaking havoc with their experiments in the family house. They were strong-willed to a fault, and perhaps most relevant to this story, they both shared a proclivity for the arts and the hard sciences. After childhood, Edwin Land and Steve Jobs followed decidedly different paths. True, they did both drop out from college, Edwin Land from Harvard and Steve Jobs from Reed College. They would continue nurturing their love of both aesthetics and technology, but that's pretty much where the similarities end for this part of their lives. At age 19, Edwin Land was inventing the first synthetic polarizer and linking up with attorneys and patent lawyers, while at the same age, Steve Jobs was dropping acid and seeking personal spiritual enlightenment in India. Land was a clean-cut New England gentleman with a piercing gaze and fancied a fine suit. And Jobs looked every bit the stereotypical West Coast hippie with his scraggly beard and unkempt hair and questionable personal hygiene, and he liked going around barefoot. No doubt these lifestyle differences can, at least in part, be attributed to generational differences, but I find it worth mentioning just because of how closely their personalities resembled the others when it came to the business of creating the future. Alright, this video is not supposed to be a history of Polaroid, certainly not a detailed history of Polaroid, but I have to address it just because I feel like more people know at least something about Steve Jobs and Apple and are less likely to know what came before instant film, which is the thing that everybody associates with the word Polaroid. So here's how we got to instant film. Edwin Land partnered with George W. Wheelwright III, a recent Harvard graduate and physics instructor, to form Land Wheelwright Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They initially found success in pioneering stereoscopic 3D imaging technology and by selling polarizing filters to everyone from sunglasses manufacturers to Kodak. Yeah, that Kodak, that one. How that all turned out is a tale for a different time, but Kodak was one of Land's first big contracts, and the companies would continue to work together and supply each other with a variety of goods and services for the next couple of decades. During this time, Edwin Land became known for his extreme work ethic and his uncompromising attitude toward the vision of his company, often to the detriment of personal relationships. 4 a.m. phone calls to various colleagues, working for 18 days straight without going home to so much as change clothes, to missing family gatherings and holidays and events, and expecting the rest of his company to be as committed and driven as he was, and getting frustrated when they weren't. His coworkers found his intensity and his demand for perfection to be either maddening or inspiring, or sometimes a bit of both. One long-serving employee, Sarah Holly Paris, even had a separate phone line installed in her house that was just for Edwin. She would pick up that red phone at any time of day, as long as my children weren't killing themselves. He was demanding, very demanding, but he was so brilliant that it was remarkable. By 1937, the company's name had changed to Polaroid, and soon after receiving Wall Street financing, they got stocks, George Wheelwright was rendered more or less obsolete. Edwin Land was the president, chairman, director of research, and the source of virtually every idea that came through the company. And Wheelwright was simply the vice president. In 1940, Wheelwright went on vacation to California and simply never came back, leaving Edwin Land in complete control of the company. And then a little thing called World War II started happening.
Nazis.
And Polaroid went into wartime production. The next few years were spent supplying polarized sunglasses for the Army, optics for reconnaissance, bomb sites, and even working on heat-seeking missiles. Land's earlier work on 3D glasses also found a use in recon with the Vectograph, which, when viewed with the proper spectacles, would show landscapes in dramatic relief, making it easier for bombers to hit their targets. After the war, Western society in general, and American society in particular, became obsessed with instant gratification. Constant news and entertainment took hold with regularly scheduled television broadcasting. The ENIAC computed complicated math equations in seconds instead of hours. Interstate highways were built. Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier, and we even got microwaves. Good old Edwin Land was like, hey, why do I have to wait so long to see the picture that I just took? The process for 1-hour photography hadn't been invented yet, and unless you built your own darkroom or lived in a big city with a lab nearby, you simply had to just finish your roll and ship it out back to the manufacturer, and then you were waiting for at least a week before you got anything back. Edwin Land had a dream of achieving absolute one-step photography. Point, shoot, see. The initial idea of instant photography was born in the summer of 1943, and the first instant camera was sold in November of 1948. Those 5 years were spent inventing, patenting, and fine-tuning the mechanics and the design of the all-in-one camera darkroom combination Model 95. It sold like proverbial hotcakes. Even Land's optimistic projection of hopefully selling 50,000 units a year was wildly off base. Between 1949, when it went on sale to the general public, and when they retired the Model 95 4 years later in 1953, they had sold over 900,000 units, which equates to almost 250,000 a year, just way outdoing the 50,000 a year he had hoped. Now keep in mind, this isn't something that the purchasing public politely petitioned Polaroid for. There was no market research or focus groups. Land despised all of that stuff, and he even once said, "Every significant invention must be startling, unexpected, and must come into a world unprepared for it. If the world were prepared for it, it would not be much of an invention." And Steve Jobs would later echo this sentiment, saying, "It isn't the consumer's job to know what they want." So, after the incredible success of the Model 95 and the cameras that would follow in the next 2 decades, Edwin Land was unsatisfied. The cameras were bulky, and the film rolls and the film packs left way too much waste, and focusing was hit or miss at best. So Edwin Land got busy dreaming.
The cameras were large, as you recall, but acceptable. They were grand machines for a grand purpose. They were a long way from the dream, which I used to talk about then, of being able to take a wallet out of my pocket and perhaps open the wallet, press a button, close the wallet, and have the picture. We are still a long way from the concept, from the realization of the concept of a camera that would be, like the telephone, something that you use all day long, whenever an occasion arises in which you want to make sure that you cannot trust your memory, or when you want to record any object of great interest to you or any beautiful scene. A camera which you would use not on the occasion of parties only, or of trips only, or when your grandchildren came to see you, but a camera that you would use as often as your pencil or your eyeglasses.
Whether or not he knew it at the time, the SX70 was Edwin Land's magnum opus. This saw Land completely rethink the instant photography process. No more cold clips, no more developing time to screw up, no double tab pull systems, no loads of waste. This was Land at his most demanding of himself and of his staff. They had a design that they'd been working on for 1.5 years before they scratched it and started over. This was Land at his most particular. The camera had to have the footprint of a wallet and the thickness of a small paperback book. The camera had to have a focus range of 10 inches to infinity. The camera had to have leather covering the chrome. And Edwin Land himself had to have 10,000 Kies Nellis tulips imported from the Netherlands for an upcoming annual shareholders event at which he was going to show off the SX70 in just 3 weeks' time. This was Land at his most philosophical. 2 years after the release of the SX70, and after seeing the effect it has on people and seeing how they share the pictures and use the camera and have embraced this technology, he wrote, "A new kind of relationship between people and groups is brought into being by SX70 when the members of a group are photographing and being photographer and sharing the photographs. It turns out that buried within us there is latent interest in each other. There is tenderness, curiosity, excitement, affection, companionability, and humor. It turns out, in this cold world where man grows distant from man, and even lovers can reach each other only briefly, that we have a yearning for and a primordial competence for a quiet, good-humored delight in each other. We have a prehistoric tribal competence for a non-physical, non-emotional, non-sexual satisfaction in being partners in the lonely exploration of a once empty planet. And then there's Steve Jobs. I honestly don't even know where to begin. The effect that Edwin Land had on Steve Jobs is inarguable. They even met a few times in the early days of Apple, and Steve Jobs would later go on to say that Edwin Land is a national treasure. Just like how Polaroid was founded near and hired dropouts and current students from Harvard and Smith College, Apple was founded near and hired dropouts and students from Berkeley and Stanford. Like Polaroid partnered with Kodak in the early days for film supplies, Apple and Microsoft partnered in the early days for computer programming. Like Polaroid later sued Kodak for patent infringements on their instant photography technology, Apple would later sue Microsoft over copyright infringements on their graphical user interface technology. Like Edwin Land, Steve Jobs was obsessed with both art and science, felt that the two shouldn't be mutually exclusive, and that you could build a thriving business at the intersection of the two disciplines. Like Land, Jobs was obsessive over the finest, tiniest details of his products. They shouldn't just function well, they should also feel and look good. Like Land, Jobs could come across as cold, aloof, and was prone to berating his employees that just couldn't quite manage to live up to his incredibly high expectations. Like Land, Jobs was a master showman and knew how to engage his audience with a combination of flair and the ability to distill complex technological information into simpler terms.
Obviously I can talk, but right now I'd like to sit back and listen. So it is with considerable pride that I introduce a man who's been like a father to me, Steve Jobs.
To be honest, I could go on for quite a while talking about the other similarities between the two men and their respective companies. I could go into depth about how both Polaroid and Apple helped revolutionize the advertising industry. I could talk about how similar their logos were. I could mention how the two men loved the idea of the all-in-one system, and how Steve Jobs eventually took that to its natural inclusion with the creation of the Apple ecosystem. But I'll just leave you with this thought. Steve Jobs, upon the release of the iPhone in 2007, finally brought to fruition Edwin Land's vision of a camera that you could keep in your pocket and use as often as a pencil or your glasses or the telephone. The SX70 and the introduction of the Polaroid Instant Film Pack was the last big innovation before the switch to digital. It fundamentally changed the way we interact with pictures, and it lowered the bar for entry into the medium of photography. The advent of the internet and the propagation of smartphones, spearheaded by Apple's release of the iPhone, oversaw another seismic shift in the realm of photography. No longer is the camera reserved for the professional or the artist, nor is it hidden away until some momentous occasion or family gathering. Edwin Land laid the foundation and Steve Jobs built the house. Thanks to them and many others, anyone can be a photographer. It's as simple as point, shoot, see.